everyone. Good morning. I'm Lucy, and it is my greatest pleasure to have the thought of this morning spent talking stories with Wendy Erskine. Wendy, I think there's very little that I'd rather do than spend a Saturday morning talking short stories with you.
Right, I gotta say the same. I've actually been looking forward to this because it does not feel like work in the slightest. I feel like I should be paying myself to do this because it's a total pleasure to sit talking about something that I really, really, really love with a person that is just so brilliant. So, thank you very, very much for having me along. It's great. It's a pure pleasure.
Such a pleasure. This do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this is like the fast bit that you get at the end of an advert, and I'll do it up at the top. This morning session is kind of to do with the Mairtín Crawford Awards, which are run by the Belfast Book Festival in association with the Crescent Arts Centre. And they are awards for short stories and poetry for emerging writers. So that all that means is that you, even if you're working towards a novel or a short story collection, you haven't published a debut collection with, they say, a recognised publisher yet. So the closing day for the awards is Wednesday, the 9th of April. There's an administrative entry fee of £10 per entry. You can enter as many times as you like, entries no longer than 2,500 words. And the winner receives a 500 cash prize, a time to write package, which includes a 3-night stay at a hotel in Belfast and 4 days of dedicated writing space in the Crescent. And 2 runners up for each category will receive a cash prize of £250 as well. And we announce the winners of these prizes at the opening of the Belfast Book Festival in June. So if you do want to find out more specifically about entering the awards, go onto the Crescent Arts homepage, the Belfast Book Festival homepage. All your questions will be answered there. But I think what we hope is that we're going to have a conversation about short stories this morning for anyone who's starting to play around with the form, whether or not they decide to enter the Mairtín Crawford Awards this year. And I think, Wendy, what I wanted to start by asking you is that it seems to me that all the great short story writers have a way of conceptualizing and describing the form. I think my own favorite would be the Irish writer Mary Lavin. She talks about the short story being an arrow in flight. I love that, the kind of intensity of it, the purity of it. Kevin Barry calls it a high wire act, that you have to keep everything taut, and if it goes slack, the tightrope walker tumbles and it's all over. Chekhov calls it a shot of vodka. Anne Enright says it's a sprint compared to a marathon. Laurie Morris says it's a love affair to the novel's marriage. She says a short story is a lovely visitor with whom you spend a really exciting weekend. And I wondered, Wendy, for you, I'm kind of tempted to think you might see the short story as a pop song, which I love. Do you, or do you have another way of seeing your short stories?
Well, I suppose, right, a way that I thought about it. So last year I was at there's a town there, like it's a sort of a estate along the Shore Road, Merville. People might have been to it, they might know it if they live in Northern Ireland. But they have a cherry blossom festival every single year, and they then have a sort of festival of Japanese culture. And I ended up going to a flower arranging display, ikebana, hopefully I'm saying that right, of like Japanese flower arranging. And it was brilliant, it was really interesting. Just watching I just like that generally, just watching somebody do somebody that's an expert. And as the woman was putting together the display, and she was talking about kind of like balance, and she was talking about the sort of empty spaces that there also need to be in the arrangement, and talking about where you are wanting a person to look whenever they look at the arrangement, and the kind of like the elements and the number of elements, and using 3 or using 5 or whatever. I thought, wow, this is like a short story. This is like talking about something that is in some ways a miniature, something that will be looked at in its entirety by someone, usually in the one go. This is so like a short story to me. So yeah, so I would say like a flower arrangement. It's like a
I love
particular
that.
type of
Yeah.
flower arrangement that involves a kind of like balance and weight, and contrasting sorts of elements.
I love that. I love especially the idea of the blank space and leaving the space. Because I think that with a short story, when you're working with so few words, and actually, a short story can argue. I've just finished a short story that's this is such a useless length. No one wants a short story this length. I've just finished a short story of 13,000 words, which is just ridiculous because, it's not a novella, it's not part of something longer, it's just that's the length that it is. But for these short stories, for this award in particular, there's no minimum word limit, but the maximum is 2,500. So when you're working with just that amount of words, I think you need to work so carefully with your silences as well, and what you ask the reader to assume, what you ask the reader to bring to it, working with your white space around your story as well.
And
And
that,
when you're writing a story, Wendy, do you put in that blank space by taking other things away? Like, how do you get that balance?
well, I suppose, I'm always thinking that as a reader, what I don't like is whenever I think things are being spelt out to me too much, and whenever I feel I'm not being treated like an intelligent person who's up for making connections, and who is up for also as well putting in my own ideas and meeting a writer halfway or whatever. So I suppose whenever it's quite far along in terms of a drafting process, I'm trying to think, well, what can I leave out here? What can I assume that my good faith reader is going to pick up on here? So I suppose quite a lot of the time I'm trying to take things away, and to continue the flower arranging analogy, which is something of, I mean, I genuinely thought that up on the spot. I haven't talked about that before. If I think I am very poor at doing any kind of flower arranging, so if I bought some flowers, I would basically take the lot and dump them into a vase, right? And it looks awful, and it looks awful because I probably got a vase that's far too small, and it's just dense flowers, foliage, whatever, right? And it's not at all what you're saying, where for those flowers to be kind of considered in all of their beauty or whatever, they need that space around them. And so it'd probably be a much cooler arrangement if I took two of those flowers and stuck them in the vats. And that would be an interesting thing. But yeah, back onto the story. I kind of think that thing where you're letting a reader kind of make connections and work things out themselves. And we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later in terms of, say, like character, sort of specificity of detail in terms of characters. I know that Claire Keegan has said that the more you keep the more specifics you give a reader, the more you lock them out from putting in their own details about that person, and that person kind of becoming theirs.
I love that. Let's tease that out a little bit more, because one of the things that, funnily, on two of my most recent stories, my Faber editor, has said is he's pulled back on a bit of my specific detail, and he has that. I was writing stories that had quite a slow pace and were quite specific, and that was his edit. His edit was just, let's just take out some of the, even one example was I had a character listening to Six music as he was looking after his toddler, and my editor said, let's just have him listening to the radio, and that's exactly the thing. You're leaving the reader. You're not what is it? You're not like pinning your butterfly.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a perfect example, isn't it? Like if you say Six Music, in some ways, some people will go, "Oh yeah, I get him. I know the type of guy from that Six Music. I listen to Six Music, and that's perfect." But then there's a range of possibilities of what the person could be listening to, and that's also a lovely thing for you as the reader to kind of speculate on what that might be. But I suppose, do you think, Lucy, the risk sometimes as well you can run with that is that it then becomes, if you leave it so totally open to people, it then becomes something that kind of loses a color, or it sort of blands out to an
I
extent.
think, I love your and I've never heard you use this flower arranging metaphor before. But I love it because there is something like, um, if you watch a florist, they'll put something in, take it out, put it somewhere else. And I think this thing with detail, Wendy, it's one of the things that you are most particularly brilliant at, is selecting the details. And we've talked about this, privately over a cocktail,
Yeah. Let's
selecting
do it again as soon as
your
possible.
character's life. Like in one of your stories, one of your brilliant stories, there's a woman who has this kind of fantasy relationship in her head with this man. And then when she meets him in real life, she sees that he's wearing the sort of shoes with the rubber bit, with like the dots that go up the back. And instantly it's like she can never even contemplate having sex with a man that wears shoes like that. And the whole story's fantasy. It's just like souffle gone, like, pin balloon burst. And it's like, I always am in such awe of the way that you manage to find or choose a detail that just does all of that. Can you talk a little bit about when you're do you is that a question of spending so much time with your characters that you know what the detail is, or does it come from watching people in life, or does it, like, how do you get to that level of detail that will bring something to life?
I think, oh, first of all, that's lovely, and I'm really delighted that you thought that bit worked because that is great. I suppose, right, I've always been somebody that's, and I know you are too, someone that's a noticer, a pretty nosy person in some respects, but I think maybe a better spin on it is just somebody that I just notice detail. I just notice, aspects of how people look or how people act or the way people speak or whatever, not in a judgy way, but just interested in how people are presenting themselves or homes or whatever. And I suppose that's just part of my sensibility, and all you've got as a writer is whatever your particular sensibility is. So mine is going to be noticing little sorts of details. So say, for example, like the natural world, I don't pay any attention to that at all. Like, so cloud formations, trees, whatever, right? It just doesn't, I just don't really notice it. So, other writers that I love are able to just use that so brilliantly in their writing. The sort of the world, nature, all of that. I just don't. So I've got that type of detail. And I suppose what I have to do is just guard against including too much detail that ends up cluttering. It just ends up being a kind of a noise or a clutter that's in some way getting in the way of
Mhm.
how people respond to the characters. So I suppose with drafting, it's about taking out quite a lot of the detail as well that I've enjoyed writing basically. But with that one that you're talking about, Lucy, yeah, I mean, I just got this woman was coming up with these incredibly detailed, specific sorts of fantasy situations about her sister's husband, and that this guy was basically the absolute answer to every problem that she'd ever had. And that's a lovely analogy. It's just like a souffle collapses with those little shoes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
One time
Yeah,
I was at an event, we were talking about this, and a guy was wearing one of those shoes, so that was quite funny because he was able to show them to people.
very good. Yeah, I love, do you know what I love that you've just said, Wendy, that I think will be really useful for writers who are just beginning, is thinking that you don't notice cloud formations or trees, and that's okay. Because I think there's something, the things that you do notice are the things that make your stories brilliant, and the things that make your stories just you. And I remember, when I was starting out, I always used to think that I wasn't a very good writer at all, that maybe I couldn't be a writer at all, because I am no good at metaphor. I am absolutely no good at metaphor. I'm not very good at simile. Also, I never know what my characters look like, which for years and years for me was a really profound. It just felt, how can this be real when I have no idea what this character looks like? And sometimes if I usually against my will, have to go back to something that I wrote early on, I'll see that I've put in a kind of artificial picture of what they look like or what their appearance is, to try to compensate for the fact that I have no idea. And then as I grew to know and trust my own writing, my own way of writing more, I realized that I don't know what my characters look like because I feel them so intensely from the inside, you know and so the only reason that what they look like matters is if, for example, it matters to the story that they're tall. I'm tall, I'm 5'10". And so, you know, if that matters to a story, then that's worth commenting on. But if it doesn't, then it kind of doesn't really matter what their hairstyle is or their hair color. And so that was realizing that that's the way that I see and negotiate the world was kind of interesting. And I realized, yeah, I do it from the inside. I do it from feeling. And so I don't need to try to overcompensate for that.
I mean, I think that's just such a key thing for anybody who's a writer to kind of get their head around. And it seems that when you say it, that it seems such an obvious thing, but it's actually not obvious to a lot of people. You know, that nobody's ever going to read one of your stories and come away really moved and being made to think and being made to reflect and go, oh yeah, but the problem with it was, so it didn't really know what the people looked like. I mean, it's a total irrelevance. Um, and
I
that,
think there will be something like Wendy. I'm looking at your nails on like you can see my nails are like the violinist player's nails, and I look no longer on. They're kind of just really short. But you have the most gorgeous nails. They're always done immaculately, and as well, so many of your characters, you write beauty salons, you
yeah,
write nail parlors, you write, and this is with some of my favorite academy students. We were talking about the ways in which you're Chekhovian, you know, writing people, maybe writing people that we might not normally see in fiction, or writing places that we might not consider the stuff of fiction. And I think that it's so interesting to think that every single person listening in to this chat will have their specific kind of areas of, what is it? It's not even interest, it's their specific ways of being in the world and moving through the world and understanding the world that is their treasure trove, really. And it might be nail parlors, or it might well be nature, you know, but there will be something that every single person has.
yeah, absolutely. And the fact that as well, if my world is the world of like nails and beauty parlors and all the rest of it, and that's sort of my sort of vantage point or whatever of the world, that doesn't preclude me from enjoying stuff that is so different to my own. And I think as well that what you're saying there about the sort of the metaphor, because I remember you saying that before, and I was so sort of struck by it. Um, I think that sometimes people think of fine writing as metaphor, and you know, people with sort of very bravura writing styles, and this is so dazzling in terms of on a sentence level, in terms of like figurative language. But really, anyone who thinks that that's what writing is about doesn't have too much of a clue. You know, if that's what people think that that's what good writing is, they don't really get writing, you know. But again, that's something that I think whenever people are maybe starting out, that for whatever reason, that is a bit of a notion that that's what people are needing to demonstrate in their stories.
But something that I often think of, Wendy, that is young Gabriel Garcia Marquez is working as a journalist, living in a sort of pension, bit down in his luck. And one evening, someone gives him the collected stories of Kafka and says, you know, I think you might like this. And he stays up all night reading it. And he comes back into the office the next morning ablaze, just saying, I didn't know you could do that. And then he's off. And you think, you know, there's the granddaddy of Latin American magical realism. And someone has just pressed the button for him. Like, he did not know that you could write a story in which a man turned into a cockroach. And then suddenly, as soon as someone just opens that door for him, he's through and off. So I think it's always really interesting to think that there will be new ways and particular ways of writing that are there for every single person that no one else could do. And somehow the thing is always to like trust your instincts, isn't it? Question your defaults, question what you expect, and find the things that only you can do.
Yeah, that's it. That's totally. It's just the word that was coming to mind there when you were talking. It's trusting that you as an individual operating in the world have got a very particular way of seeing things that isn't like other people, and that you will be able to find a way of putting across this story,
Yeah.
that is also not going to be about. It's not going to be done just like other people, and it's amazing just to be constantly surprised by how people can actually do that, you know. I know that we've both read a writer, the writer that's going to be published by Stinging Fly. The book's
Oh my,
coming
I
out.
have the book here. Yeah, so this is a book by Leda Quinn. It is published by Stinging Fly in March. It's coming out with Grant in July. It is astonishingly good.
Is
And this writer, they are doing things. The title story, We All Go, I think is a masterpiece. And this writer is doing things that I don't think anyone else could. And I think, you know, yeah, well, Wendy, what's your take on it?
well, just the same as you. That this is again, you could say, "Oh goodness, more of these stories from Northern Ireland," and this person's doing this, whatever. But it's just so different. It's again a person of a particular age, a particular kind of worldview. It's so distinctive. Again, a lot of these things, we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later, but the sort of prevailing wisdom about short stories in terms of this needs to happen, that needs to happen, then you need to follow up with this type of approach. That doesn't occur in most of these stories. It's a person absolutely going their own way and doing something really magnificent.
Yeah, brilliant. We should let's bring this back to kind of what what do you think then makes for a short story? So say someone is thinking they might give it a go and they want to write a short story. What for you, what makes a short story? What's inspiration? What does it take to make a short story?
What does it take? Right. So, for me as a reader, or for me as a writer, for both,
Very
or
well, interesting if you think there's a difference.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Bro, so for right, yeah, yeah, I do actually think they're different. Right. So for me as a writer, whenever I start down, I might think to myself, right, I think I know, I want to write about a particular character, or maybe I've got this a particular little situation that I think I maybe want to deal with. But to be honest, at the very beginning, Lucy, I do not know at all what it is that's gonna happen. And so my way of working is to write a really, really long first draft. And I suppose, like, here's another analogy. This is one I have used before. Like, what I'm thinking of at the stage of writing the short story is that it's like the penny falls in the amusement arcade, where you're putting in 10p, 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 and you're hoping there's going to be some sort of configuration that's going to get some sort of a payout. So it's maybe very disparate sorts of ideas that I think that I'm putting together, or disparate people. And I don't really know where it's going to go, but I'm hoping that there's going to be some kind of energy, or there's going to be some sort of charge created through the combination of these elements and just following them in a really, really long first draft. Um, and
Yeah.
then I suppose what I have to do is, after having written that long first draft, I need to go back and I need to think to myself, is there a story? Is there a story here? Has this just been an interesting exploration of possibilities? Or is there something here that I think that I could make and I suppose this is the kind of the actual crux of it, something that's is going to be a satisfying experience for a reader, in terms of being in some way a cohesive experience for however many minutes that they're gonna read it. I suppose, in terms of as a reader, then, if I'm reading a story, what makes a story? Again, I am so there's no one really neat answer, because it's just so dependent on what the story is. Basically, all I'm wanting to, and it's not that I'm wanting to be necessarily moved, or it's not that I'm necessarily wanting to have some sort of you know encounter a character that's undergone a change, or whatever. All I'm wanting from a story is to feel I enjoyed that. The time I spent in that world was worthwhile. And sometimes that can be because of an ending. Sometimes that can be because of the process of reading the story. There's all sorts of different reasons as to why that might be a worthwhile experience, but ultimately that's all that people need to do, as far as I'm concerned. Make it an enjoyable reading experience for the period of time where it exists.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What's interesting, Wendy, is I think you do all of your thinking on the page in that big first draft of yours.
Mhm.
Funnily, I would not tend to start writing until I've done a lot of the thinking in my head. Like tend to spend a lot of time, if I'm walking along the street or if I'm taking a bus somewhere, just letting my characters talk in my head and doing a lot of the thinking and a lot of the I think when I start writing a story, what I always see a short story as is it needs to be some it needs to be alive. It needs to be enacting the process of change. I do always think something needs to be fundamentally different at the end. We've watched something be lost or gained or realized or understood or glimpsed or apprehended or and I think you can take it up to it can be a rising knowledge that can no longer be suppressed, but I think you need to take it to that somehow something needs to be fundamentally different. And then I always think that I think of we both are fans of the way Claire Keegan talks about it. She talks about the incision in time,
Yeah.
at what point you cut in and at what point you cut out. And so I'm always thinking with my short stories. And so then I do like your first draft and kind of try to take a look at it. And then I think, okay, what is the most important thing here? And so where is the best place to start? And then, where is the best place to end? And I think when we're talking about beginnings, I love like Catherine Mansfield is brilliant at them because she will start a story with and after all it didn't rain, the garden party. And it's like the story is called The Garden Party. The first sentence is, and after all it didn't rain. And so we as a reader, we don't need to see the weeks and weeks of people worrying that the weather is going to be bad and do they need a marquee and what's going to happen. All of that we presume in an instant. And to me, that's something that makes a short story. Right at the start of this conversation, we were talking about what you ask the reader to do. And I think suddenly as a reader, I'm completely involved in a story because I'm part of the world before the story began. And I'm reading The Garden Party to think, why is this significant? Of all the garden parties this family holds in their life in this house, why am I seeing this one? It's because something irrevocable is going to happen, I think.
And see, whenever you were saying, Lucy, about you're looking at your draft and you're thinking, well, what's interesting? Does it ever surprise you what's interesting? Is it?
Always, yeah, always. And I think sometimes I have this, we're kind of leaping about here. I was going to come to this in editing, but it's kind of relevant now. The way that I edit, I got this tip from Joan Didion's Paris Review interview, and she talks about getting it from Hemingway actually, and she said that every new draft she retypes, and this might not work for everybody, but it has been brilliant for me because what that does is of course I edit on screen during the writing of stuff, but every sort of substantial new draft of a story, I print it, I have it to my left, and I retype it back in. And I do that because I think that when something is on screen, it is too finished, it's too final, especially I write in Garamond because it looks very elegant, and that just looks too polished, and it's very hard to lever the bars of text aside and write something new. But what I do is sometimes, in a first, second draft, you can't expect to know your characters at all. By the eighth or ninth draft, you will really know them, and you want then to give them the chance to say or do unexpected new things. And so when I'm retyping, it feels like if I suddenly catch a draft, I can go somewhere brand new with the story, something that has never happened before. And if it doesn't lead anywhere interesting, I can just cut, paste, delete, go back to my printed pages. But I do this as a way of letting the story surprise me right up until the very, very last draft.
Yeah, we've talked about this before,
Mm.
and I do the same. I do it exactly the same way, and even just that detail you're saying there, but you've got the draft on the left. That's exactly the same way that I do it. I'm sitting in exactly the same position, printing it out, having it on the left there, working again, starting from scratch, and it's exactly as you say. It still feels alive. It's still totally. There's all sorts of possibilities that still reside within that story while you're working, in that fashion on it.
And sorry,
Absolutely.
I just finished a story that's about a mother watching the winter solstice on live stream watching the winter solstice at Newgrange on live stream from basically Folkestone, and until a very last draft, I had there was just a couple of lines in the story of explanation of, she's the whole story is just kind of nothing happened. She's just watching this live stream and the solstice isn't happening. And then there's this moment of surrender. And until quite a late draft, I had the thing that she feels she needs to give up that was in the story. And then I realized, actually, and I realized this in conversation with my editor again, that that can go. It's enough for the story to know it. I needed to know it to write the story, but somehow, even if you take out those few lines, the story still knows it. It doesn't need to be spelled out. And we're back to your flower arranging, aren't we? The taking out of something to create that space. And it's funny because reading that story now, I can feel that that thing is there,
Mm.
even though it's not literally spelled, which is an interesting thing.
That's a really interesting thing. That is a really interesting thing. And like just to go back again to what you were saying, Lucy, about like first paragraphs. I think that's the thing. And I still feel quite anxious about my first paragraphs because again, sometimes the prevailing wisdom is that your first paragraph has to be something that is a showstopper that maybe people have heard this that people say that judges or readers or whoever, if you're not absolutely, if you're not in it, if you're not impressed by this first paragraph, that you're not going to continue. And I just think that the first paragraph is really important, just as you're saying, because you're making your incision in time, and you're inviting a reader into a world that you're asking them to break off from their real world and into this fictive world. So it's a crucial moment that you need to get right. But again, it's not trying to do something that's terribly, not in keeping with the rest of your story. So, that first line that you used there is a beautiful example of a kind of an economy, and placing a reader absolutely in the where you want them so early on.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a couple of things that people might find useful here. Um, The first is that I think you probably don't know what your beginning should. It can be, in in kind of like a Hollywood movie, someone opens up the laptop and they write like chapter one and they're kind of off. But for me, that never happens in real life. Quite often, the opening of something is one of the last things that I write. But
Absolutely,
until
absolutely.
I know what the story is, until I know where it's going, how are you supposed to have any idea of where you need to start?
Yeah, that's it. You don't know where you start where interests you, and you just keep writing on that first draft, following what's.
Maybe that would be, it's quite, I find it really heartening to think that might be liberating for people who
Yeah,
want to write a short story, but who get tied up in knots about how to begin, where to begin. Just, it
yeah,
doesn't matter. Your beginning will come maybe in the final draft. Just
yeah.
get started anywhere.
Totally. You're looking at that beginning, you're maybe putting that into place weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, months maybe later. So don't worry about it. Start where it's interesting, and that will all fall into place whenever you have more of a sense of the shape of your story and how it's operating. Absolutely. I think that's crucial.
Um, let's think a little bit about this because we are we are very much in alignment about this idea that you don't need, car chases and pyrotechnics and gun battles in your first paragraph. And there is a lot of anxiety about people thinking
Yeah.
that they need to do something. For you, what is it? For me, I think when I read a short story, it can be very quiet. What I'm looking for, it's very hard to explain, but there will, what I want to know is there's a surety, there's a confidence, there's an economy, someone is in control of their world and what they want this short story to be. Do you have a more useful way of putting that for anyone?
Uh, well, I suppose I feel exactly the same way, and I suppose the only analogy I can use here is that so I don't drive, I can't drive, I failed the test 7 times, but so I drive a lot of in taxis, a lot of the time in taxis, and sometimes I get into a car and I just know, I just feel quite comfortable in the car. The person seems to me like a good driver. And I couldn't, if somebody said, well, tell me exactly what you mean. I couldn't quantify, I couldn't say it's the way they brake or it's the way they do whatever, but I just feel it that, and I'm not speaking to the taxi driver. It's not like they're saying I've passed advanced proficiency, whatever, driving, right? It's not that. It's just a feel in that car that I like this. This is a good driver, right? And it feels the same way with the story. You just feel that you're in good hands. There's a there's a nervousness that I feel when I start reading because I kind of think, oh, I'm not sure quite what's there's Jess has failed their test 7 times as well. Like to hear it. Um, it's just it's just knowing that the person has the confidence to do what they're doing and that they're making decisions in terms of what they're doing in this way that's for the benefit of this story and this reading experience.
Yeah, so I suppose to people listening, the thing is, again, we're back to just trust the thing that you're doing. Don't try to like put in cartwheels for our sake. Um,
Yeah.
just trust the thing that you're doing and the story that you were telling. Um, Wendy, is there something when we're reading these stories for this award, and we've done it, you and I have done it for the last couple of years, would you say there's anything that you're looking for in particular? Or anything actually, and as well, anything that puts you off, anything that makes you think this is a no.
Right, there's nothing actually that makes me there's nothing that makes me think this is a no, right?
Mhm.
And I could actually go through elements here of things that I always wonder if it's a good idea to do this, right? And I can go through these now, right? But what I would say is that anytime I make a splashy pronouncement about anything, I also know that the absolute opposite can also be true. So say for example, one of the things I would say, Lucy, is just be careful if you're including children in a story. Um, and there's two things that I think people sometimes do. Sometimes people make the children into little seers, these sort of incredibly wise kids that come out with the most, you know, unbelievably perceptive points, or have an understanding way beyond their years, and that strikes a very phony note.
Mhm.
Also, as well, people will include children, and the children will be, just there to be cute. Okay, and to me, both of those things, the cuteness and the little seer, are kind of pointless. So if you're including a child, you can only the child can only have that particular worldview of the 8-year-old or the 9-year-old. So that's actually a difficult thing to do, I think, and to make it convincing. Another
This is like
thing.
when sorry, this is like in TV series or in films where someone says to a couple of children, "Okay, run along to bed," and the children just obediently abandon whatever they're doing and run along to bed. And you think, come on. But
Totally.
it's funny that with everything, I always feel you read, say, Edward St. Alban, and his children are exactly all of the things that you describe. They're hyper articulate, hyper knowledgeable, wise beyond their years, and it works.
That's
So it's interesting, isn't it, that
Yeah,
there's
absolutely. And like another thing that I always think, I wonder if you should include that. See this sort of shortcut to the subconscious, the use of the dream, right? Sometimes I think to myself, oh, that's just lazy. That was a real shortcut there. You could have let me know that in such a better way than this big chunk of a dream, you know? Um, are there also novels I love or short stories I love where dreams are used incredibly? Absolutely. There's that too. Um, Dialogue is another thing. If you think the dialogue is really heavily sort of expositional, if the dialogue doesn't feel as though it's well, it depends again what you're doing though, right? I try to go for dialogue that's kind of quite naturalistic and sounds like I hope like people speaking, but dialogue doesn't need to be like that at all. Somebody else could do it in an entirely different sort of way, and that's also okay. But I'm also alert to dialogue that I think seems as though it's just like really heavily expositional. Somebody comes through the door, um, they're speaking to their partner, and the first thing is that they immediately start talking about this thing that's been on their mind all day, and there's no kind of hiya. Even it just again seems like to me not all that.
Yeah, the example I always think of is someone picking up a phone and saying, "Oh, it's your sister Kim on the phone, phoning from Sydney," and you think, no one, like no one, no one, no
Yeah,
one, no one does that. Yeah,
yeah.
interesting. So yeah, a couple. Is there anything that you are looking for? I mean, we've we've had such varied stories on our short lists, haven't we? But is there anything like what do you think grabs us? And Riley Johnson, who's reading the stories with us again this year.
Yeah, so um yeah, so I suppose what I've really been struck by, Lucy, is how different the stories have been, that whenever we've had shortlists, that they have been so wildly different in terms of subject matter and also as well in terms of style. And so I kind of think that what we're looking for, and again, I'm using this analogy I've used before, but it's like the TK Maxx thing, right? When I go to TK Maxx, I have not a clue what it is I'm looking for. I just know there's something in this shop that will speak to me in some way, and it could be oven gloves, it could be, a t-shirt, it could be, I don't know, it could be a pencil case. And I suppose I do approach judging competition in that way, that there's not something that I'm particularly looking for in, it's just stuff that is going to engage me. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, for me, I will go anywhere. I will read anything. It's that thing. If something feels, to me, it's if something feels alive. If
Mhm.
it feels like it's got soul, if it feels, if I can feel the writer's surety, I think, if I can feel the writer's conviction. Um, I am very much not a fan of a friend of mine. We have the analogy of this finely turned prose, like someone lifting up a skirt to show a delicate ankle, and and they want you to know how fine the ankle bone is.
Yeah,
And I just think I that's writing that is trying to be self-consciously good
yeah.
writing.
That
Something about that just is dead to me. But writing that feels like it's alive. I always like stories that feel like they're process. I always think of it as the process rather than the product of something.
yeah.
And I think of this, I learned this myself from Chekhov. Those great speeches of his on stage. If an actor does them like they're unrolling a carpet to be admired, it's completely dead on stage. But if someone delivers those speeches as the attempt in the moment to reach for something that they're almost failing to articulate, then that is alive on stage. That's amazing. And for me, the short story, if it feels that there's something alive, I will forgive it all manner of other things.
And I think that sometimes what stops things feeling alive is people's desire to appear clever.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I'm quite often in a draft trying to remove myself and the things that I think make this story clever, because that means that you're not servicing the story, you're trying to service yourself and how people perceive you. And so a lot of the time the cleverness has to be left out, or the whenever I say cleverness, I mean a sort of very, in some ways, a sort of meretricious cleverness, something that seems quite showy. And I suppose like what I do feel, Lucy, is like I've known you for a long time, and I know you to be an incredibly clever person, like a very clever person, and yet to my mind you're never that's never the drive in your stories, or even in whenever you're speaking to people, to show off as a smart person, as a clever person. um the stories are not there to be stories that you're saying, I am taking every opportunity here to show how much I know about narrative techniques and how much I know about, philosophy, literature, whatever. And it takes a real confidence and a real discipline to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's very kind of you to say. I think I've got a particular sort of into bookish, I'm able to read a book and understand it, maybe. But yeah, I think that it's that sense that yeah, being in service of the story of whatever demands might be. I think that is absolutely crucial. And I wrote a story recently called Hamlet, a love story, that was about a young Belfast theatre group taking an experimental production of Hamlet to New York. And I had to spend weeks and weeks and weeks. And I had a whole exam paper at university solely on Hamlet, and I've seen it several times, but even so, I had to spend weeks and weeks and weeks reading the play so that I knew it as well as one of the actors who are appearing in it, for weeks on end. But then the curious thing is, when I'm writing that story, everything that I've learned that's of interest about Hamlet or Shakespeare or what my theories are, they need to go, And it's like their production of Hamlet, I don't even think it would work. If I was directing a production of Hamlet, it might be to do with, Gertrude and Ophelia, or it might be feminist, or it might be all these kind of things. But for the story, it's completely irrelevant whether I have a feminist take on Hamlet or not, because these young people are just not interested. And so a lot of the work of that story was doing exactly that. It was taking away the temptation to show off the in-depth knowledge that I have from, studying Hamlet, and making sure that every observation comes from the character and is serving the story.
That's it. And the discipline of that means that there's so much you're going to have to leave out, but the story is absolutely paramount. I've got a similar sort of thing, but not in the story. It's in the novel where I'm sort of interested in the whole idea of like post-Reformation, like whitewashing was seen as we think about whitewashing as something negative, but like whitewashing and the beauty of a pristine, pure white building is something amazing. And can that be as wonderful as can that be as kind of spiritual as going in somewhere where there's all this kind of like amazing Renaissance art or whatever. And so I was seen in a folk museum where it's like a mother and a kid go to the folk museum, and they go into this building that's all white like that. And it's the same thing again, it would be totally preposterous for these two people to start talking. They wouldn't, neither of them have the slightest bit of interest in this whole kind of context. But so you can't use any of that. Can't use any of that at all. But at the same time, is there some way I can work the feel of that, or some sort of dimension, the vibe of that into it slightly, but without ever being in any way explicit about any of that type of research. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that. Um, and there's the idea as well of we were talking about Lyd and Quinn, and the first story of theirs, We All Go. There's a student doing anatomy at Queen's in Belfast, and the description of the anatomy sessions. Um, it doesn't matter to me whether the author has been a medical student at Queen's or not, but what does matter is that the narrator of that story needs to be. I need to believe in that. So, Wendy, how would you get, especially, if we're writing a novel, we have the luxury of, so many words and chapters to get our readers to believe in our characters. When you've only got a short story, how do you get the reader very quickly to believe that this is an anatomy student, or that this is, someone who works in a nail parlor, or whatever it might be? What's the trick for you in that?
Well, let me see. So, I mean, if I was going to write about somebody that was going to work in a nail parlor,
Mhm.
um, what I'm going to try and do is just what you were saying earlier about thinking about that person quite a lot. There's no shortcuts to this, in my opinion, and there's no hacks. Like, there are no short story hacks whatsoever. That if you want this thing to come alive and you want this thing to work, you do have to spend such a lot of time thinking about the places, and thinking as well about the people. So if I was having to write about someone who works in a nail parlor, I would just try and, number one, write about them from the first person. That's what I always start. My final stories are never first person, but I'll always start writing first person at the beginning.
So
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I always just try to be the people and just get myself positioned, and to try to feel who they are. Um, and so I suppose what I would do would be a bit of research on nails, and a bit of research on the kind of, even just like the basics. It doesn't sound very interesting maybe, but just even like the schedule, like when would you arrive? What would be your sort of protocols in the morning whenever you come in that you have to
Are
do?
you doing this? Are you like Googling this? Are you
Yeah,
looking at
yeah,
Instagram? Are you going
yeah,
into it? Like
yeah.
how are you doing this?
Yeah, all of that. And I mean, it's a pure play. I mean, I spent hours and hours and hours a day just Googling stuff, and I enjoy it greatly. And so, yeah, I would be Googling about nails. I would be qualifications, like what qualifications do you do? What would be, level one? What would be level two? And knowing I'm going to use none of this, right? None of this. I'm not ever going to have, to justify my, looking at City and Guilds level two, whatever. I'm never going to have the person having a conversation going, well, the year I got the City and Guilds level two, which involves, modules in, all this is, all this is never going to make it, but it's all informing the person, and their sort of take on the world. And I just need to buy into that idea that a lot of your time spent on this is not actually going to make it to the final story, but it's also time well spent because it'll just add a sort of a richness
Yeah,
to.
it's, and I love, one of the things I always think quite often, Wendy, I think that my writing is quite often just a byproduct of being interested in the world. Because I think there's no other way or life or reason that I could be so like intensely and weirdly fascinated by so many random things. But if you're writing a story, it gives you license to do that. And I think as well that there is no there's no shortcut. Like I remember I was writing something once and it was about a luthier, repair of
Oh,
steel.
I remember that. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I quite often, it's a really useful teaching point because I was quite, like at the time I was quite busy and I was writing this piece and I grew up, I know my way around a violin. I grew up with violins and playing musical instruments, and I probably thought like I probably could have winged it, but I always think never skimp, like there are no shortcuts, the story will suffer. And so I made an appointment to see a luthier and just said, can I see your studio? Can you talk me around the whole process? Um, and it was just brilliant. And the first thing he said to me was, there is nothing that a stringed instrument can't recover from apart from fire, because once it's burned, it's gone forever. And it was like, oh, there was my one of my first lines, and he was talking me through everything. And it made me think, I could have got an approximation of this, but if I tried to have a shortcut, I just I wouldn't have got what I need for the story to feel real and for it to feel alive. And I always think that there's a sort of research that involves going somewhere and talking to people. There's a sort of research that involves Googling or, reading history books. But I always think that the most important research, I think of it as a sort of emotional research. I think of it as spending enough time with your characters. Whenever you do that, whether you do that when you're cooking or on your commute or walking down the street or whatever it is, spending enough time that you sort of sublimate yourself and you start seeing and responding to the world as them.
Yeah, oh, totally. And I think that sometimes whenever people talk about this, it can sort of sound almost a bit mystic Meg, that it's becoming as if you're being in some way kind of taken over by these characters. But ultimately, I think that is kind of what happens. And it's also quite necessary for that to happen because I'm sure you'll have had this experience, Lucy, where it's almost like the character pushes back against what you might have the plan you might have had for this person. They push back against it, and it's like, no, I actually wouldn't do that, or I wouldn't say that. And that's just that sublimation of self, really, and letting the character, rather than act as a vehicle or some sort of cipher or whatever, that they actually live, I suppose you would say, and
Yeah,
decide the
free
story.
will. Yeah. Wendy, can we talk? We've sort of talked editing as we've gone along, which is really interesting. I had in my sort of notes here, we've just gone kind of way off piste, which is lovely. But I thought we would just, I find it really interesting that we've been discussing editing from the very start.
Mhm.
We haven't come to editing as a separate sort of self-contained thing. The idea that a short story takes lots of different edits and lots of different drafts has been in our conversation from the beginning. And I wanted to discuss this because I always think people think of editing as you know, you edit a story. But actually for me, there are so many different phases of editing. And should we talk a little bit about
Yeah,
what
that's
they
great.
are for you? Uh,
Yeah, I would, I don't think I've ever uttered the word editing in relation to my own work. If I'm talking about somebody, if I'm talking to somebody and they say, what are you up to? I say, I'm working on a story. So I suppose for me, I am editing. That's exactly what I'm doing, but to me, I don't see that as a kind of a separate part of the process. If it's just like working on a story, and working on the story could be that long first draft, or working on the story could be, it's just still editing is still just working on the story. So it feels like I suppose if I was looking at it in terms of editing, I suppose that editing probably accounts for about, I don't know, about 7/8 of the actual work on it. Yeah, probably.
So what does it, so say for me, I will have, I will do all my thinking.
Hmm.
I will only start writing, I think, when it feels like it's bubbling over, when it feels like I can't not, you know. And then my first, say, draft of something, first written draft, and I always type. I never do longhand because I still hold a pen like a child, like a fist with a child, and I never learned joined up. So my first, it'll be like this. But my first draft, I will be kind of maybe like you. I will be very, very free, and I won't stop myself if there are contradictions or if if I notice that I've got two characters who are sort of serving the same function or any of it, I just won't change it as I go along. I'll just wait till I have a first thing and then I'll kind of look at it. And I think the first edit that I do will sort of be that sort of structural one where I'll be asking myself those questions, those incisions in time, and I'll be saying, okay, so what really is this story? Like what is it? What is going on here? What's the most interesting thing? What's the live thing? And so where do I need to start? Where do I need to end? I always try to tighten the time frame. I think, well, does this really need to take place over several weeks, or could it take place over one afternoon? I'm kind of trying to like tighten everything. And then there will be a few drafts, like edits, a few editorial passes, typing and typing. Um, and then I think as it gets closer to completion, the edits will get smaller in scope, but they will still have a potentially vast difference to make on the story. So I'll be looking very precisely at all of my rhythms. I'll be looking at all of my punctuation, all the sort of stuff that I think you can't do in a first pass because it's just too overwhelming.
Mhm.
Um, and I think as I go through it and go through it and go through it, there is an editorial stage for me as well where I'll have printed out and read it, I'll have had it on my laptop. And actually what I do funnily is I'll get it up on my phone and I'll like turn my phone sideways and I'll read the story because suddenly you see it in a different way. Um, and
Yeah.
the very final bit for me will be sort of obsessively reading it and experiencing it for the last time, because once it's published, I always feel you can get it in glimmers what you were trying to do, but the story never, it's gone from you or something. So I will have this sense that there's this window before it closes over that I can experience it, that I can still make changes, it's still molten. Um, what's it like for
Well,
you?
my process is pretty much similar to yours. So that first draft, number one, that first draft, writing with no restriction, know there's all the contradictions, same as you. Sometimes the character, they'll be in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I don't know who they are yet. So they're simultaneously about 10 different ages, because I'm just trying to get to know them. And then I look at that first draft and think what's of interest, and sometimes it's a surprise because something that I thought was quite peripheral is actually really something that I realize it should be central because there's a sort of an energy or something about it. And then I start again, same thing as you, where I'm starting to get a bit more of how does this structurally, how does this exist, and who should be telling the tale. That's also another thing, a big decision that I need to make at some point, because nobody is essentially telling the tale in the first draft. It's just all sorts of different first persons usually. So that's thinking to serve this story best. Who is going to tell this story? From what perspective? In terms of sort of temporal structure, how's this going to work? So it's all those things, and then it's just moving, getting it like I don't know, it's like um, a lens that we just feel that this is just just twisting it different ways to get it clearer and clearer and clearer. So it's a very similar process to you, where I suppose the edits change as it goes on and on and on. They're less structural, and it's becoming sort of finer detail. A couple of things that I would do would be, sometimes I find that there's something in the story that's bothering me and I don't know what it is, that there's something that I'm snagging on. And here's me saying about dreams, oh, dreams are no good or whatever. But what I sometimes do is I read the story before I go to bed. And quite miraculously at times, when I wake up in the morning, I have a bit of a sense of what the problem is. Whatever way the subconscious has worked during the night, I sometimes it's that bit, it's that character, or it's that place, or it's that conversation, or it's something or other. And another thing as well I do, Lucy, is that I'll print off the story. So I'm print same as you, printing it off, reading it, starting again from scratch. But I'll print it off and I'll take it to a different place to read it. So I'll maybe go and sit and read it in a different place, like a coffee shop or just another location. For some reason, sometimes that brings something else to it. Just locating myself somewhere else makes me read it slightly differently. Again, I know this sounds a bit bonkers, but it does sometimes make a difference.
And Wendy, at what point do you show someone else into your work? Like, do you show your husband your stories? Because funnily, I don't.
No, I don't. And right, I've never been one of these people that shows work around lots of others. I've just haven't been. Even though I started off doing Sting and Fly Fiction Workshop, which is exactly that, I don't think it's my natural mode. So I think one of the most important things, Lucy, really is being able to trust your own judgment and to think like the idea of me handing a story to people and saying what do you suggest I do with that ending. I just would find that a strange thing. I kind of think, well, that's my job and that's up to me to work that out. Quite often my stories have been shown to Declan Mead from Sting and Fly, who's like a great friend and a great editor. And I'd be his advice is always really interesting. It's always just, I think I'll leave that one with you, right? That's the sort of thing that he would say, or I think I'll leave that opening with you, or whatever. So it's a very non-specific comment that he would make, but it would get me to reflect again on what I'd done. So I think it's wonderful if you've got people that you can show your work to. Um, but at the same time, I think it's really important to develop your own sense of, somebody says they don't think this works. Well, listen to it, of course, take it seriously, but also as well, think respectfully, I've heard what you say, but no, I think it does actually
Yeah,
work.
that's
That's
so.
what
And
I
I
say.
think as well, it's so important having, especially when you're starting off, to work out what are you expecting when you give your story to someone. Like for example, I always used to give my stories to my mum, or my novels then to my mum, because she would just be so flooded with pride that I'd done anything, that she would just say, this is brilliant. And then at a certain point, I was writing different things, and I realized, what am I doing? I'm asking permission, I'm seeking approval, and that's not a healthy thing as an adult. And so the relationship changes. But I think sometimes you need someone to, sometimes it's fine if someone just wants to think you're brilliant. But say I asked, about like your husband, maybe the person closest to you in a lot of ways, because I would never ask of my husband that he reads my drafts. Hardly even, like, he'll read my finished story. He's phenomenally supportive of, I was in India for the last 2 weeks, and he was at home solo looking after the children, so that I could be there. He's incredibly supportive, but I will not ask his, he's an architect. I will not ask his literary opinion. There's something we always laugh about, where years ago I gave him a draft of, a very like emotionally wrought story to read. And he said to me, he kind of finished, and he said, yeah, I read it. And he said, I think in the paragraph on page 5, you actually mean a Velux, not a Crittall window. That was it. And at a certain point, that is a very useful critique. But if you're asking that made me really think, whoa, okay, what is it that I'm asking for you in this transaction? And it might not be healthy for our relationship for me to, seek, whatever it is. And so I have, like you, Wendy, I don't tend to share stuff, but crucially, I do think that you reach a stage where it's really useful to have someone. You need to sort of externalize it. You need to be able to talk it through with someone. Maybe I've got one sort of first reader that I've been working with for over a decade. And then my editor I've worked with for about 15 years. So someone who really knows what it is that you're doing, someone who can help ask you those questions, I think is really useful at a certain stage, if you're clear on what the the transaction is, on what's expected. And I think that's why it can be so useful if you're starting out to have a couple of friends that you're swapping work with, because it forces you to share stuff. It forces you to, you know, champion your own instincts. If you think what everyone else is saying is wrong, and but it allows you to do that in a way that's reciprocal. You're not asking something of, your partner that they're not able to give.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, yeah, to set those parameters from the beginning as to, what it is you're actually looking for is just like super, super, super sensible, you know? I suppose like a question, sorry, Lucy.
Oh, no, no, I was just going to say, just tell everyone we're going to come to the chat box for questions in a couple of minutes. So if you do have questions we haven't covered, uh, pop them into the chat, and we'll go through them in a sec. Sorry, Wendy.
The question that I suppose, I will sometimes show my work to people, and my question that I'm most, frequently asking others, Lucy, is do you buy this, right? Do you buy it? um, does this do you buy that this person would do this? Do you buy it that this person would think this? Do you buy it that this would end this way? And that's not meaning that I want everything reduced to whenever I'm reading, I want everything reduced to like a really dull realism that that there can't be anything unusual. I mean, just within the context of that particular story, do you buy it? And so I suppose that's also a thing when I'm reading. I'm thinking, do I buy this? Do I buy this? Do I buy this? And the other question as well is, I ask people, when you read it, do you just at the end think, well, so what? So what? And I think
Okay, so
that,
I want to talk about endings. This is, before we come to the questions, this is exactly what I want to talk about, because for years, my stories didn't work. I was writing stories for 10 years before a single one of them started to come to life. And by that stage, I'd published 3 novels, several stage plays, radio dramas, and my short stories would be exactly that. I'd think I had a really good idea. I think I had a plot. And I'd finish a story and it would just be, so what? That would be exactly it. And I would not know what to do. What do you what do you do if you're finishing a short story and it's feeling like, instead of unfurling and growing, it's desiccating and shriveling up and dying and so whatting? What do you do?
well, sometimes I think, right, let's put it aside. And, well, sometimes I'll be kind of try to be quite forensic about it and think, well, what do I think is actually the problem with this? And, does it need to be written from a different perspective? And sometimes that I think that's such a crucial thing. Who's telling the story, and what is the actual narrative technique that you're using, or techniques that you're using? Sometimes that can kind of that can set you in a different direction. So, say for example, I had the story Gil Courtney, which is about this guy that could have been a pop star, and he comes back living in Belfast.
It's called 77 Facts about
Yeah,
Gil Courtney.
77
And
pop.
every single person who has read this story, including myself, has Googled Gil Courtney to see who this person is.
Lucy, I tried so hard with that story. I had it, and I knew it was really a story. In some ways, it seemed to me about a mother and son. And so I'd written it from the mother's point of view, so like a third person partial from the mother's point of view. I'd also written it as well from Gil Courtney's point of view. I'd written it as well from fans' points of view. I'd even tried a burglar who'd broken into the house and had discovered all the sort of artifacts of the house and what he was piecing together from that. It was all dreadful. And, I put a lot of work into it. It was thousands of words. And every single time I just thought, well, so what? Who on earth cares? Who cares about this guy? Who cares about all of this history? And then I hit upon how I could tell it in this way, where it's these facts, and it came alive. It just came alive, and I got it written in one night, and I was utterly euphoric because I knew that it was starting to work, and that was form was the key to that. So that was one where it worked out really well. There's other times though where I thought, so what, and I just think there's nothing I can do. I maybe don't have the skill to execute this effectively. Whatever reason, it's not working. And that's the beauty of the short story form, isn't it? You've not committed a year or 2 years to write a novel. It doesn't work. That's the beauty of the short story form, that you can go, well, let's leave it and let's move on to something else.
I want to talk about endings just before we come to these questions, because I find it interesting, Wendy, because we both sort of talk about endings in a different way, but I think we sort of mean the same thing. And for me, with an ending, before I start writing a short story, I have no idea necessarily what the ending is going to be. But funnily, I always know what I need it to feel like. Like I always think that it's like the note that you strike that continues reverberating. Or sometimes I think that an ending almost can shiver through the story retrospectively to give it all meaning, to bring it together. Or sometimes I think that I think if you think of a short story as an enactment of change, then the ending, you're sort of setting up these rhythms, and you're sort of generating this energy, and something can happen and you can get somewhere. And I think so often when my short stories weren't working, it was that they didn't sort of transcend themselves. They didn't go anywhere else. They just stayed on the same plane. And when I started being able to use the mechanics of the short story to glimpse something else, or to attain something else, or to, I don't know, do a sort of euphoric swoop, or to get somewhere. And what am I doing? I'm doing this with my hand. I'm kind of going higher. That's when they started working, I think. Um, and so for me, the ending, the ending is always the point of the story in a way. And interestingly, I know you wouldn't say that, but I think we mean a similar thing. So can you?
Yes, we do mean a similar thing. So yes, I mean for me, I suppose when I say I don't think the point is the ending, I kind of think that um, if your whole story has been a kind of a preamble to a final paragraph,
Oh, yeah,
and that feels I just feel it, and I've written stories that I think probably fall into that category, to be honest. But you know, to me it kind of feels a bit, for me it kind of feels a little bit cheap. It's kind of like if like a Shakespearean sonnet where all the meaning is clinched in
yeah,
well, maybe somebody writing a Shakespearean, I don't want to diss the Shakespearean sonnet, somebody trying to write a Shakespearean sonnet where the whole meaning becomes clinched in this final rhyming couplet. And it's like you go through all of that to boom, get that punchline. I think endings like that, I don't love. Or where I can see somebody's cranking up to the epiphany. It's a 5-page story, and down the bottom of page 4, the epiphany's coming. I kind of think, right, okay, so why not make the story work really hard the whole way through? Sometimes I think as well, if you drop off the final few paragraphs, is this story still of merit? Was this story still something that was really good to read?
Yeah, I remember hearing Kevin Barry once say, talk about the penultimate paragraph, the turgid dread or something of the penultimate paragraph epiphany. And I went through, like, I felt completely sick. And I went through my stories, my drafts, and it was like, okay, penultimate paragraph, yeah, penultimate, and there's something, yeah, what is it? It's something formulaic. Maybe that's when a story is so what?
When it feels sort of formulaic, when you feel that yeah, I could see this coming, but at the same time, the ending is so crucial, and I would have to say that there's times whenever I get to the end and I'm disappointed, and I kind of think I wish you hadn't done that, because it was going so well up until that particular point. So I kind of think with the ending, again, that's one where you need to trust your reader a lot. This person has been with you on this journey, if we want to say this, for the last number of pages, minutes, whatever way you want to think about the duration, and trust them as well to be able to project beyond your story. That's one of the pleasures as well, I suppose, of this as a form, that after that final full stop, you've also got the whole concept of sort of like future time. And so the ending doesn't not things do not need to be spelt out. If there's a sense of, not like it's utterly inconclusive and it's like, so what, but if there's possibilities and there's projections for the reader, that can be a really satisfying
I
thing.
loved, the hairs went up on the back of my neck when you said future time. And I think that's exactly it for me. The short story, the magic of it is that it's not a complete, I think if it's a complete thing, it's done and it's dead. And for me, there's something really magical in the sense that the story, the story is kind of the story is pre-existing. And what you do as an author is, for a moment, you just open up this portal, so we can see this thing happening, but it existed before and it's still going on afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's totally artificial. Where you decide to
Yeah,
open that portal and where you decide to close it, it's absolutely artificial because that time is still continuing. Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
lovely. Love it. Final question, Wendy, before we go to the chat. How do you know when a short story is finished? One of your own?
Again, this is not really very useful advice to people, Lucy, and I'll be so interested to hear what you think, but it's just a feel, it's just a feeling. It's a feeling I get. I can probably literally, actually feel it in my stomach that
Or
I
do
think,
you feel it in your stomach?
uh-huh, that yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Now, have I read my own stories back again and thought, oh, I wish I'd done that, or I wish I'd written this bit differently. That could have been better. Absolutely. I feel that all of the time, when I read my stuff back. But you know, realistically, you have to stop working on these things at some point and put them out into the world if you can. And it's a physical feeling where I think, to the best of my ability, I'm not thinking, will this do? Is this more or less okay? Will this do? To the best of my ability, do I think that this is at a stage where, it can't go any further at this point? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the same. It's a feeling. And for me it's what I love. There will be the time when it feels most alive and it feels that my mind is working faster, I'm making connections faster. It's probably something akin to, you read the ways people describe a sort of schizophrenia and everything making sense and a sort of heightened, you get it. I can think more clearly, and for a while, there's always a particular time for me writing a short story, and it kind of happens towards the end of a novel, interestingly, where I think you get this sort of terminal velocity where it's almost like it takes off and it's weightless, and that's when time slips by. And that's when, normally I'm a kind of reasonably diligent mother and I try to feed my children vegetables and limit their screen time and do their piano practice. But there will be a couple of days of working on a short story when there's just this wild amorality. Nothing matters except the story. And I don't care if they're playing, Minecraft or whatever they're doing, FIFA for hours on end, and, having pesto pasta for a third night in a row, because all that matters is the story. But then I can feel that pace starts to drop off. And there's something like the short story becomes, it almost, it's almost like it closes me out. I have served it to the best of my ability. And then there's like this feeling, and you did what you did your stomach. I can feel this sort of like drawing away, like it's kind of closing over, and I can understand it less and less, and I can have less and less impact on it. There's a moment where it's molten and I can change things, and then it closes over again. And then all I can do is, for a few days after, I can read it and I can understand it and I can read it, and then life goes back to its normal pace. And I'm back to saying, nope, you've played FIFA for 45 minutes. Let's do your spellings or whatever. Um, but for me, yeah, it's kind of the pace of the story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm loving what you're saying here because I not really ever heard people talk about it like this, to be honest. Because it's actually making it sound really exciting, and it is. I mean, the whole idea of the writing and you having to have sort of special circumstances, be it a writing retreat or whatever, all of that, I never really get that. But what you're saying here, I totally identify with, and it's so exciting. And the real world almost doesn't matter a lot of the time when you're in the absolute throes of that. Like I would have it. I think I said one time that I felt like I like writing short stories because it's such a total high when you're doing it, and it's like a drug, and you're able to do it all the time. That's what's so wonderful. If you're writing a short story collection, you can get this high over and over and over again. And I think, the way we've been talking about this, it's making it seem quite magical and really intense. So we're talking about sort of portals, and it's almost time something that's like beyond you, it's something really magical, but it is also as well just like a lot of hard work too, isn't it?
It's a lot of hard work. And I'm just thinking of the times that I've been desperately trying and failing to write a short story with both children in a duvet under my desk watching Shaun the Sheep on my phone.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
but yeah, it's a lot of, I suppose it's more interesting to talk about those magical moments, but yeah, a lot of grind really. Let's go to the questions. I put together a draft of a short story recently, a few months ago, to show students like what it looks like from first
Mhm.
idea, which I wrote on my phone, to first drafts and everything. And this story, this is my Hamlet story, and the story is like just shy of 8,000 words, but my document was like 70,000. And it's like, that's a novel.
Yeah.
That's, that is like a 300-page novel. And that is just something of the work that sometimes a short story takes. Let's see. Oh yeah, Jess in her driving test. Jess, well done on passing the driving test. Um, uh, Anne Hood says, take your manuscript out on a date. I like that, Wendy. That's what you do. You take it to the local cafe.
Yeah.
Um, oh yeah, here's another thing. This is a good one. Jess says, I'm really interested in what you've both said about trusting yourself, and I'm curious as to how you arrived at a place of trusting your own writing and the relationship between that and when you began to get published or other external validation. Yeah, Wendy, this is an important thing to discuss because, this is a competition, and, for good or for ill, competitions are a kind of unignorable part of our literary economy,
Mhm.
our literary ecology. How do you deal with someone who submits a story and it doesn't get longlisted, shortlisted, win the cash prize in the writing time? Like, how do you deal with rejection and with despondency and all that kind of thing as a writer?
Well, I think number one, you just have to acknowledge that if you want to do writing, that this is an inevitable part of it, and it's an inevitable big part of it, and also as well just to also acknowledge the fundamental injustice of things, that there are just so many wonderful writers out there and wonderful books that just have never, for whatever reason, found big audiences, or readerships. It just is the way of things, and so much depends on luck and timing and all these absolutely uncontrollable elements beyond your writing. Um, so I suppose this sounds terribly pat what I'm going to say here. And my experience is that I didn't enter loads of competitions. And so in some ways, maybe it's very easy for me to say this, but I suppose the thing is that you have to think that whenever you're writing a story, you're writing a story to write a story that's a really good story and that is absolutely something that exists in the world and is alive and is your own. And you're not writing a story to try to win a competition. Because competitions are again just subjective, and we've said this before, that a different group of judges will make a different decision. you know
Possibly even the same group of judges on a
same,
different day.
the same group of judges on a different day, you know, will make a different decision. So there's something incredibly arbitrary about this. And so, of course, everybody wants some sort of external validation, and it's kind of necessary that people get that somewhere, but just don't elevate the competition too too highly. I don't mean this competition, I mean just competition generally, because there's so much else at play.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. I mean, I've been, you know, longlisted for stuff, shortlisted for stuff, won stuff, judged stuff, and you see just how arbitrary some of it is. Sometimes I might have been shortlisted for something or won something and thought this is not the best thing on even the long list, and then other times there's been something of mine that I've thought, well, this is really good, and this has got nowhere. So I think once you see something of the workings of it and you see the way, I think it's impossible to understand until you've been part of a judging panel just how arbitrary it can sometimes be, even with the best people, even with the best intentions.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think bearing that in mind, that's really important. Okay, let's see this chat. um, let's see. Um, uh, okay, Elaine says, what is something you've watched recently on TV, film, and stage that you really loved, and why? Do you know, I adored Colin from Accounts. It is incredible. It's a terrible name. It's this Australian sitcom, and you watch the intro sequence and you will know whether it's for you or not. And I absolutely love. It's very funny, but it's very dark humor. Very, very funny. I think I also loved the New Zealand series. It's got a bad title. It's got a very unmemorable title. Is it called something like Under the Skin or Under the? It's a woman who teacher. She's been married for 40 years, and at a party she sees her husband doing something ambiguous to a teenage boy, and she suddenly realizes he's a pedophile, and no one else believes her. And that I love because the acting is phenomenal. The acting is just incredible. The nuance of all the performances, and also what I love is that the you're with her, but you're not quite sure that she's right. It-
Oh, that sounds great.
this is both of those I've absolutely loved. What about you? What have you watched or seen?
Well, do you know what? I normally don't watch or see all that much, but I went to see on Tuesday. I went to the cinema to watch a film, and it was like a showing of a film from years ago, Beau Travail, Claire Denis. So I went to see that, and it was absolutely wonderful. It's about guys, French Foreign Legion, and it's all about sort of male jealousy. It's all about I don't know how to describe it really. It's about people jealous of other people's relationships, men jealous of other men, and it was absolutely brilliant. But what's really great about it is, you're kept outside these characters, so you're having to work out what you think is motivating people. It's beautiful, beautiful film. And then there's a film. I've ended up watching this film a lot recently because I'm writing something about it. The film Mama Roma, which is about a 1960s prostitute who tries to, develop a new life for herself as a market stall holder and sort of gentrify her son, and it doesn't really work out. So that was absolutely brilliant. Teenage boy, and it's absolutely fantastic. So it's like a film where the director would usually work with people that were like ordinary people, inverted commas, and so
Called Wendy, sorry, that the one that I was referring to is called After the Party.
after
Thank
the
you,
party, yeah,
Canada.
that sounds
After the
brilliant.
Party. Yeah, it's really, really good. I think we probably have time for one more question. Oh yeah, we'll do two more questions. One is, of all the ideas you might have for stories, how do you choose which to work on? And then the final one is, do you have a favorite short story written by an Irish author, maybe not well known, that you could share with us? So Wendy, yeah, of all the possible short stories you could work on, how do you choose? And then favorite short story.
Okay, so the way it works for me is that I only ever really manage to think about one of these short stories at a time. So I never really have the concept that there's this sort of panoply of all these potential ideas. Something grabs me and I go for it.
Yeah.
And what's great is I know that the next month something else could grab me and I could write another one of these short stories. So I just go for whatever is just most immediate to me. What about you, Lucy?
Exactly the same. I can only work on one thing at a time. And the couple of times that I've tried to, they've ended up being the same. They've ended up like bleeding into each other. They've ended up being exactly the same thing. Yeah, it's that there will be something that's more, and kind of funnily, what you find is a couple of years ago, I was doing this workshop on writing childhood, and I wrote this, like it went nowhere. I wrote maybe 2,000 words about a child learning Suzuki violin, which of course I did, but it kind of wasn't a story, wasn't anything, didn't go anywhere. Just sat there in a folder. And then recently I was commissioned to write a short story about a musician, and I suddenly realized, I've done the work already. This belongs. And so I think there's a funny sense where and it wasn't a case of cutting and pasting it in, but it was like that was really funny. I had captured something, I'd done the work, and then a couple of years later that was right for so I often think that sometimes it's like I like the image of the story almost like a magnet, and all of this detritus that we have and are and accumulate, I don't know, Yeats's rag and bone shop, suddenly particular stuff is charged. And I think the story, like iron filings, all the stuff kind of comes to the story, but I can only have one of those going at once,
Mhm.
I think. Okay, yeah, final question. I really like this question of what a story by an Irish author that you would recommend.
Okay, a story by an Irish author that I would recommend that maybe isn't one that loads of people know about would be Maggie's Day Out by Frances Malloy. And it is very, very short story, maybe only a couple of pages. But I think it's a brilliant story.
Brilliant. And her collection is No Mate for the Magpie. She's a Derry writer and she writes in a sort of very like Derry accent. Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah, I will give well, yeah, the opening story of this that is forthcoming, We All Go, by Leda Quinn, I think is absolutely fantastic. And the collection actually one of the collections that I most loved last year is by Maggie Armstrong. It's called Old Romantics and it's published by Tramp Press. And it's kind of it's messy and the stories overlap and it's chaotic and it's got soul and I love that. And so if you're interested in Maggie's writing, there's a short story published online that I read recently called Divorcee Moon, um, that I really enjoyed. So yeah, check those out. Okay, thank you everyone who has been with us, and thank you for your questions. I mean, Wendy, always such a pleasure
Such a
to
pleasure to talk to you,
and
honestly.
I should say, Wendy, the novel that Wendy briefly referred to is her absolutely stunning debut novel, The Benefactors, which is out in June. And I gave a quote. It was such a pleasure to give a quote for the back. And I'm not sure if I put this in the quote or not, but I certainly said it in my email to the editor. It makes like 90% of contemporary fiction look dead. It feels so fresh, so alive. Yeah, I can't recommend that highly enough. So that is it June? Am I correct? It's June.
June, yeah, June the 19th, yeah. And yeah, thank you so much. It meant such a lot what you said. It was just brilliant to get that. But thank you, thank you.
So welcome. Brilliant. Well, good luck with your stories. We look forward to seeing some of them. I should say, one of the nice things about this competition is it's judged completely anonymously. We have no idea who the people are, ages, names, nothing like that. We only find out after the winners have been selected. So I think there's kind of a nice freedom in that as well. So good luck with your competition entries. Check the website for all those terms and conditions and details. And Wendy, you're giving an in-person workshop to people who might be in Belfast, aren't you?
Yes, so I'm giving an in-person workshop. It's not next Saturday, but it's Saturday after. And I suppose it'll be a little different to this. It'll be maybe looking at, not exactly a checklist, but certain aspects of your story that you might want to consider. So maybe thinking about point of view, maybe thinking about how you manage time, maybe thinking about how you manage setting, talking again about editing and, different types of edits that you can make. So it'll be a little bit more, I suppose, practical in application. But again, what it's not is me giving hints as to what sort of stories that I think, win competitions or anything like that. It's just really about you getting your story as good as you can get it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone. I think that's us now. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All the very best.